there's all sorts of reasons why we are not always rational. And some of these reasons, though, in some way, in some sort of paradoxical way, reflect our rational natures.
Yes.
So we're often irrational in cases where we respond in what would have been a rational way in the environment in which we evolved.
Right. I think another reason, though, a way in which they're rational, is that some of these flaws, I'm begging the question by calling them flaws. I don't mean to call them flaws. Some of these corner-cutting operations that might sidestep full rationality are rational in the sense that they might work out most of the time. Maybe that's what you mean by having this evolutionary origin. But what's key in the route that I'm going is that they save us on computational power.
That's right.
I don't mean to be presupposing some computational model of the mind there. I mean,
no, you could do that. Okay. I'm good. I'm cool with that.
Okay.
It's a line I think Gerd Gigerenzer has made, which is a lot of things are seemingly irrational, but they fail to take into account that we have limited resources and limited computational power. And sometimes there's sort of quick and dirty hacks that are useful and sometimes lead us into error.
Right.
So, one of Kahneman and Tversky's famous examples is the availability bias, which is I ask you how frequent something is, and you answer by how quickly examples of it come to mind. And, that could easily lead you into mistakes. So people overestimate, terrorist attacks and plane crashes and underestimate more mundane things like heart attacks and strokes, because when there's a terrorist attack, it's extremely salient. So it's easy to think about it. And so those are mistakes and maybe rational in sort of the immediate sense, irrational in the immediate sense. But it's not a bad way to do things. It's not a bad rough and ready trick. We don't have Excel sheets in front of us all the time. We don't have the data in front of us all the time. So this isn't a bad way of judging how frequent something is.
Mm-hmm. This is not a good analogy. There's a lot missing, but we can easily imagine an evolutionary history in which the eye was able to see maybe not electrons, but something significantly larger. We could see our tables and laptops with much, much more detail, but the dramatic rise in brain power that would require would make it completely not worth it. But we see just the amount of detail necessary, even if there are some key features that are missing.
That's right. It comes down to literature on satisficing, where
unsatisficing.
Is that the right term of sort of making do with what you have under sort of limited constraints?
I like that word. It has a real nice sound to it. I've just never heard it before. That's all.
Well, okay, I'll lay upon you just because I'll show you I'm a real psychologist.
Thank you.
Some pop psychology, which may be a nonsense. That
I'll add
two types of people.
Analyzans in my
analyzans, right? You get them both in one sentence. There's not a party in the world where they wouldn't welcome you. Mm-hmm. So often you could distinguish between maximizers and satisficers. I confess that I am a satisficer. That I'll just look at a menu and say, I'll that. And I'm married to a maximizer who will look at everything and judge, the options and so on. And so, and I mentioned this in my book. There's sort of a constant tension, but the truth is we're all satisficers to some extent. I'm sure if you spend 4 hours staring at a menu, you'll make a better choice than if you just spent 5 minutes. But nobody would ever want to eat with you, and you'd be miserable. And that's sort of that's just an analogy for life in general, which is we have to make quick decisions based on limited information. And even in cases where we would do better by thinking about it more and absorbing more information, we have to be mindful of the fact that there's a cost in doing that.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of this, I hadn't been thinking about it beforehand, but have you looked at any of the literature at all on decision fatigue?
I've heard only to hear the phrase, which is there's such a thing as decision fatigue. Mm-hmm. And there's some controversy over the extent to which we get tired about making decisions. But having said that, I think it's a real phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess the reason that it comes to, or the way in which I think about it is that I often go to the gym earlier in the day, because if I have to make the decision later in the day, it's much harder to go. But this might not be a true case of decision fatigue. It might just
No,
be...
it's a good example.
Okay, good.
Barack Obama was being interviewed in Men's Health, and asked, why do you always wear the same kind of suit? And he said, because I have to make so many decisions each day, so I try to cut down the amount of unnecessary decisions. So I don't want to have to decide what to wear. I just wear this suit.
Mm-hmm.
And it is kind of a life hack thing where people are advised cut down the number of decisions you make, because each decision you make takes a little bit out of you. And again, I think that's common sense wisdom, and it seems so intuitive, it's hard to believe it's false. But I know there's some controversy over the extent to which we actually get tired when we make decisions.
Well, another, maybe, I don't know if you want to classify this as a cognitive flaw, but it didn't actually come up in the book. I have in mind the sunk cost fallacy.
Oh yeah.
And I know this is big in the economics literature.
Yeah.
I don't know how big it is in the psychology literature,
No.
though those things dovetail
Yeah.
Quite a bit. But are you familiar with much of the literature on that topic?
Just to know there's such a thing as a sunk cost fallacy.
Okay.
I think the classic example is, something about going to buy a movie ticket.
Yeah.
And you have money in your pocket, and you find you lost the money, and you don't want to buy another ticket. But if the ticket had cost double the amount, you would have happily bought it. Is that a good example?
Yeah, that's a good example. I mean, so when I discovered the sunk cost fallacy, it like had a big impact on my life in a number of ways. I mean, one thing is, I used to be the sort of person that when I start a book, I always finish it because I have it, I've purchased it, I feel like I am obligated to do so. But now, I mean, if I start a book and I get 20 pages, I mean, that's just an arbitrary number, but I don't continue just because I paid for it. Yeah,
that's smart. It's smart. The sunk cost fallacy is thinking it's a good argument to say, I got to finish it because I spent all this money on it. And that's not a very reasonable way to proceed.
Mm-hmm. Well, another of the fallacy, well, I don't know if you want to call them fallacies, but that's in the book is base rate neglect.
Yeah.
What is this one?
It's when, again, this is mostly from Kahneman and Tversky, and it's the fact that when we have to sort of do probabilistic judgments, like is this person a farmer or a musician, well, actually, to stick with that, it's a nice illustration. A nice illustration of the base rate fallacy is you tell somebody there's somebody and he's very cultured. And he loves going to museums, but he particularly loves music, and he has a very expensive music equipment at home, and he reads biographies of famous musicians. What do you think he's most likely to be? A musician in a symphony orchestra or a farmer? And people will say, oh, I'm a musician in a symphony orchestra. They tend to say things like that. But the thing is, these I'm going to made up numbers, but there's like 100 musicians in symphony orchestras full time in America and like 1 million farmers. So these base rates, the probability, not knowing anything of what this sample you're picking out is likely to be, means he's almost certainly a farmer.
Mm-hmm.
And but we tend not to focus that much on base rates. I mean, another example is, your neighbor. Imagine your neighbor is reclusive, but he has a large collection of guns and and he shows all the signs of being a serial killer. Well, he probably isn't a serial killer because there are not many serial killers. It's a very small proportion. The the base rate, the illustration of avoiding base rate fallacy comes from doctors, which is when you hear hoofbeats, think of horses, not zebras.
Right.
And if you're just as likely to say it's a zebra as a horse, you're ignoring base rates. There's a lot more horses.
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming there is, actually, from this analogy. I don't know anything about horses and zebras, but I just assume.
Yeah, the way that this actually, now that you spell it out, the way that this comes up in my life all the time, and I'm sure pretty much everybody's lives, to the extent that we're social, is we're constantly thinking that other people are thinking about us.
Yes.
When in fact, they're probably not, when you think about all the other things that they in fact have going on in their minds. It might be difficult to translate this to the base rate fallacy, but I think there's something very
No, I like that. It's clever. I mean, that stumbles onto another thing, this time from social psychology, which is the spotlight effect. And the spotlight effect is very cool. The spotlight effect is the tendency we have to think that everybody notices us and that we're in the focus of everybody's attention. So there's some really nice studies by Tom Gilovich. What they did was they got people to wear T-shirts. And sometimes the T-shirts were somebody cool, like Jerry Seinfeld. Experiment was done a while ago. Yeah. Or somebody uncool, like Barry Manilow. And then you walk through a room of people. And then they ask you, how many people noticed your T-shirt? And people say, they all noticed it. They were all talking about it. But then you ask the people, and they never noticed. Study after study finds we overestimate how people are focused, the extent to which people are focused on us. And the reason for it's pretty clear. I'm focused on myself all the time.
Yeah.
So I just assume everyone else is, failing to realize that they're focused on themselves. So they're thinking, I bet everybody's noticing me. I like the spotlight effect. I like knowing about the spotlight effect because, you talked about the sunk cost fallacy, appreciating it as a fallacy, changing your life. Learning about a spotlight effect kind of helped me realize that when I do something embarrassing or screw up, people don't care as much as I worry that they do.
Right. And I mean, this T-shirt example goes back to my own life and your life, I'm sure, as well. But in high school, I would get like cool new clothes or something and be terrified to wear it because I thought everybody would make fun of me. But as I've gotten older and I buy cool new clothes, I'm not as worried about that.
And on the plus side, not many people, as you would hope, would think, man, you're looking sexy today. Yeah. They're worried about their own clothes.
Yes, that's very true. But what this makes me wonder is, did you find yourself, I mean, this is more of a meta question abstracted from our conversation, but did you get involved or become attracted to studying psychology as a career path because of all these myriad ways in which it informed you about who you were and your own experiences and allowed you to analyze them in another level of depth?
No, I don't think so. I think, what was it, the film? I think we all have these narratives about why we do what we do. Yeah. I love the example from The Dark Knight of Heath Ledger's Joker, telling you how he got his scars and telling the story and telling somebody entirely different story later on. I think, so my narrative for how I became a psychologist is my brother is autistic. And so when I was a teenager, I worked with autistic kids. And then when I went to an undergraduate at Yale, I figured I'd become a clinical psychologist and work with kids. And then I bumped into this professor just by accident, John McNamara, and I ended up working with him. And he was a philosopher and doing philosophical issues. And I began to think what he did was really cool. And then I went to graduate school and so on. So it just happenstance.
Mm-hmm. And then Freud would tell you, of course, that your narrative is all wrong. Everything came from the unconscious.
And again, I will give Freud props here, which is whenever somebody tells you their origin story, you should think bullshit. And that's just a story. You've probably tried out other stories and you settled on this one, and maybe you believe it now, but it's just a story.
Well, there is one other fallacy or cognitive bias that I noticed in the book, and this one has to do with framing?
The idea is that you could get exactly the same question posed to you, but how it's posed affects your impression of it. How the options are framed. So imagine advertising a condom that is promised to be 99% efficient versus a condom that fails 1% of the time. It's pretty clear which way you're going to go with. And some places will argue that this product is 95% fat free, as opposed to 5% fat. and there's a million cases like that. Kahneman and Tversky did some really interesting studies where they give people medical decisions to make, and then these real two options, but one option is framed in terms of number of lives it would save. So out of 600 people, we know it will save 400 people, but not the rest. The other one is pretty much the same option, but it's that out of 600 people, 200 people are going to die. Not more than 200, but 200 people are going to die. It makes a huge difference for how people do it.
I interviewed your Princeton colleague, Tanya Lombroso, a while back, all about explanations, and it was
really
phenomenal.
Tanya's incredible.
Yeah, and so many... the way that we perceive explanations in so many cases depends on the way that they're framed. One thing that has stuck with me that I found pretty funny is if you throw jargon into an explanation, even if it's non-functional, we will perceive it as a much better explanation, or much more satisfying.
There's all sorts of real-world examples. One example I really liked and really struck me was from a study where they say there's a custody hearing and you're the judge. So parent A is average in every respect. Parent B has some really good points that make them a really good parent, but also some bad points. So, a good point might be exceptionally loving and caring to her children. A bad point might travels a lot. So in one condition, they ask people, who would you give custody to? And people say parent B, because the good points are salient. And then the other group of people, they said, who would you deny custody to? And people say parent B, because of the bad points. Now, they can't both be right. They're just the inverse questions. So the answer should be proportionally adding up to 100%, but they aren't. The framing matters a lot. And this is something where people involved in negotiation and advertising and persuasion know a lot about this, and will frame things. We'll often take something which is true, but frame things in a certain way to make it additionally persuasive in the direction you want to take it.
And I don't know, maybe Tversky and Kahneman averred their own hypothesis as to why we would have this sort of framing bias, but what sort of, are you willing to speculate on, in this one in particular, what sort of heuristic process it's filling in for?
Yeah, I think some of the biases we talk about reflect sort of adaptive mechanisms that sometimes go awry. I think the framing effects are a little bit different. I think the framing effects just capture aspects of language comprehension and sort of concept activation. So if I talk about failure, 1% failure, you're now thinking, oh, well, now my mind is thinking about failure, as opposed to 99% success. I'm thinking about success. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it has a sort of nice story as other things. I think it just takes advantage of facts about our general psychologies. Mm-hmm. One simple, boring example of a framing effect is often the order in which information is conveyed is important. Under some circumstances, for instance, you want to save, if there's something you want the person to focus on, save it for last. Mm-hmm. And that's a framing effect. And it's not very interesting. It just has to do with language comprehension.